morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Hi, I'm Eitan Davidson, Vice President of Communications for Purpose-Built Communities. Before we start, since the room is not totally full, I would like to invite everybody to move up a little bit so that we can make this conversation a little more intimate. So please, I'll take the minute, come on a little further up. This will be very much worth your while. I'm still sort of, I don't know what the word is, but the last session was very impactful for me. I often find, this is my 5th conference now with Purpose-Built Communities. My first one was in Charlotte, and at every one there have been these moments where, you get this feeling of something happening in there. It gives you something of a high. It gives you a very sort of powerful emotional reaction, and it's very centering. And I think that session certainly did it for me. This session, I think, is going to work on a different part of your brain, your heart. Our next speaker, we're really glad that he's here. Nat Kendall-Taylor leads the Frameworks Institute, who we were introduced to sometime within the last year. And we are really glad we were introduced to them. I've been a communications professional basically my whole career, and I've done communications a certain way, and that's one way to do it. What Nat and the Frameworks Institute do is different. They are research-based. And so what Nat can tell you, as you see the title of this, The Science of Better Storytelling, it really is that. When you think about communications, it's more art than science, but there actually is science that you can apply to it that can be extremely helpful and beneficial to what you want to do, so that your message lands the way you want it to, with the audiences that you want it to. Now, I'm not going to say that this is like, I'm not like selling one of those infomercial products or anything, but there's a thought process here that is really, really helpful, and I think will be really eye-opening. So with that, please welcome Nat Kendall-Taylor.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you all very much, and good morning. It's Friday. Yeah, it feels like a long week, but we made it. I hope you all are doing well. I am very excited to be here to talk with you all today, and I'm very, very, very excited to get 60 whole minutes to talk to you about the science of communication, about the science of framing. The fact that I am this excited to talk about the science of communication, I realize, is totally sad and utterly pathetic. But after many hours of deep personal work and introspection, I'm totally okay with my geekiness, so you can be as well. I wanna start with where I hope we can get by the end of this session, and I have 2 goals, and only 2 goals here today. They both start with the letter H, which is nothing more than mildly cute coincidence. It's not some framing magic trick that I'm pulling on you. I never frame on friends. In-laws is a different story, but never on friends. So the first H is helpful. I hope that by the end of this, I can take the work that we do on a whole variety of issues, but some work recently that we've done on housing and community development, and offer it to you all as one tool in a quiver, in a toolbox that you have to use to do your work. Which leads me to the second goal, which is humble. I fully realize that framing is not everything. It is not the Holy Grail. It will not fix all your problems. So please don't go into it thinking that, and don't go into it thinking that I think that. I'm fully aware. Obviously, I'm really excited about the work that we do, but I'm also fully aware that it is one and only one small part of the work that you all are doing. But hopefully, throughout the course of the day, you all can realize that it is one small but potentially really powerful and important tool that can help you do your work, that can add value to the work that you all do. So I want to start by telling you a little bit more about myself. But again, from the humble perspective, I don't assume that you actually care or really think that you should care, but rather where I come from And I don't mean Cleveland, Ohio, which is where I'm from. I don't know if there's any Cleveland. There's always a Cleveland person in the room. I guess not today. They're at the other session. I mean kind of my disciplinary background, how I got to where I am, is actually really important in the work that I'm going to be talking about today. So I am, ironically, not a communications professional. I have zero training in communications. I've never worked in PR. I've never done the kind of work that most kind of communications people do. I am by training what's called a psychological anthropologist. What that means is that I study the way that culture influences how people think, how people use culture to process information, to make meaning of messages, and importantly, to arrive at decisions of how to engage on social issues, decisions on whether to act or not in addressing social problems. And when most people hear that I'm an anthropologist, the reaction is typically that they feel really bad for me. Kind of what horrible decisions this gentleman has made in his life. What a shame. And I say to these people, I say, Mom, Dad, anthropology is actually not some ivory tower, useless discipline, but is a real world tool, right? And in our conversation today, I hope to show you that it can be used to help us all, each and every one of us, be a more effective communicator in the work that we do. And so I do this work on culture and communication and understanding, not alone, but with 30 other people who get as excited about framing as I do. Not all of whom are anthropologists, thankfully for the world, but people who are sociologists. You gotta laugh at all those little jokes, by the way, if we're gonna, yeah, okay. People who are sociologists and political scientists and social psychologists and linguists and people who work on public health and social policy. And what we do is we do three things at the Frameworks Institute. So first of all, and I'll be talking about primarily the first two, but I'll hit on all three. The first is we study public thinking. We study how it is, again, that people use culture to make sense of complex social issues. And we work on a wide variety of dire social problems, kind of united by the thread that we work on social justice issues. So we work on criminal justice and immigration and mental health and poverty and homelessness and housing and environmental justice and you name it. And we're really interested not in what people know about those issues, but as I'll talk about in a second, deeply how they think about those issues in common, predictable, and in many cases, somewhat depressing ways that people have of making sense of the work that we all do. So that's number one. Number two is that we do work on framing. So when I say framing, I mean we test different ways of presenting information and determine how those different ways of making choices in how we communicate have impacts on how people think, on how they feel, and importantly, on how they act. The third thing that we do, which took us an embarrassingly long time to realize that we had to do, after realizing that doing those first two things, writing unbelievably moving and awesome 50-page research reports, smacking them on the desks of on-the-ground advocates, did not for change make. We now do a lot of training and technical assistance and workshops, and we actually take our work and the work of other social scientists and bring it to those who are doing the hard work on the ground of framing and communicating about social issues. So with that background, let's get going. And what I want to do today is try to answer, in addition to being helpful and humble, I want to try to answer this one question that you see on the screen today. I'm going to give you a set of reasons. I think we're going to do 6 reasons, 6 answers to this question. And as I go through this, there will be a pattern that you will notice. So I will present an answer to this question, and then I will proceed very quickly to not ask you to take my word for it. And I will show you evidence from research that we've done at the Frameworks Institute on a wide variety of issues. I'll try to draw where I can on the work recently that we've completed on housing, but the caveat there is that work has not yet been released, so y'all can't tell anybody that you heard it. That camera will have to shut that off at various points. And to try to illustrate these kind of answers to the question that I'm going to make. And the first answer to this question is this fundamental, absolutely fundamental truism that comes out of, I used to say 50 years of social science research, but I've been doing this now for 15 years, so now I have to say 60 years, is that understanding is frame dependent. Now, I realize that's kind of gobbledygook academic-ese. It is something that someone with a PhD once said, but what this means is more simply that it's not just what you say, it's not just your content, it's not just your data, it's not just your ideas, but it's how you say it. that matters, that determines the effect or the impact of that information that you have to communicate. Okay, so again, don't take my word for it. I'm going to give you a quick example. And for this example, I'm going to go to another continent. I'm going to go to some work that we've recently done in Australia on the issue of parenting, so that you all can have some kind of productive distance from this example that I'm about to give you, but that I will very quickly pivot to some work that's closer to home on housing. So in the field of parenting in Australia, folks for a very long time, I'm going to be kind and say 30 years, but it's probably more like 40 or 50 years, have been using kind of what you see on the screen as their orienting frame for their work. They talk about do's and don'ts of parenting and lists of effective practices and things you should never do again as a parent. And you notice I'm wagging my finger because this kind of blaminess is part of this frame. Now, in a lot of work that we did over about a year's worth of time, qualitative work, we found there to be some promise in an alternative frame. And that was kind of shifting this finger-wagging things you should do as a parent to framing the issue around child development. That to raise healthy, productive, thriving children, parents need support. Now, this may look like a subtle framing shift, but it is actually monumental in terms of the way the issue is positioned by a whole host of organizations. So we did this in qualitative work. We saw that when people could think about child development and parenting as a way to support and drive that development, the conversations that were had were like 180 degrees more effective. So we tested this quantitatively in an experiment. And I'm going to be talking about a number of these experiments, so I'll kind of walk you through this right now. So this is an experiment with about 15,000 Australians selected to be nationally representative. And what happens here is that those 15,000, I think it's 14,798, are randomly assigned to hear different messages, to read messages that are framed in different ways. So some folks log onto this experiment and they get randomly assigned to hear kind of the practice du jour, the way that people have been doing it, the effective parenting message. Another person logs on, they get randomly assigned to hear the message framed with this idea of child development, and then a third group logs on and they get nothing. They're the control condition. They read no message, but then they all answer questions that ask them to indicate their support for policies, so kind of progressive parenting policies that are on the docket that advocates want to move in Australia, but also a set of behavioral intentions. You know, would you be willing to volunteer? Would you be willing to donate money? Would you be willing to become, involved in a race that's being run to support this issue? And so when you run this, when you look at the effect that those two frames have on policy support and behavioral intentions, this is what you get. So I don't know the statistical acumen of this audience, so I'll give you a quick stats lesson. Up is good, and down is bad. So what you see here in what for members of the field, again, this allows you to have some productive distance, is that what members of the field have been doing for, again, being kind 30 years, being realistic 50 years, with gobs of money, is advancing a frame that not only wastes all of those dollars, but that actually uses all of those dollars in a way that disadvantages the very goals for which they are advocating. That is, in case you can't hear the tone in my voice, that is bad news. That is not what you want to be doing with your communications dollars. The good news is that there is this fairly subtle but quite significant way of reframing this issue that has the opposite effect, that boosts people's support for policy to statistically significant degrees and gets people to indicate their intent to behave in ways that kind of we would approximate as being kind of civic engagement and issue involvement. Now, there's a number of different ways of explaining this, but one of the best ways is captured in this meme that I found online, which is a lot of this effect is driven by the fact that telling parents what to do and wagging your finger. I mean, some of these tip sheets actually have like a finger on them pointing at people. Does not make people open to thinking about this issue in different ways, to supporting public government policies that would support parents and families. So now let's go from Australia and issues of parenting, where you can kind of do this this is hilarious, let's laugh at this stuff, to work that we've done on the issue of housing here in the United States. And this is part of work that we've done with enterprise community partners that will be released in the next 2 weeks. So if you all are interested, I would encourage you to kind of check our website in the next couple of weeks, and if you want to, you can sign up for the listserv, and you'll receive this when it's out. It'll also be disseminated by Enterprise. And so as a component of this work, we were really interested in not the usual question in the field of communication. So I don't know how familiar people are with kind of communications and how people study race and equity, but there is this whole question, which I'm not going to get into, of kind of whether or not to talk about race in the issues that we work on. And so we did not answer that question, and we started from the premise that you have to talk about race when it comes to issues of housing, because it's part of the issue and it has to be talked about. So the question that we asked was not whether or not, but it was how. So if you're kind of delivering a message that calls out the inequities that exist in access to affordable housing and all of the disparities and inequities that limited access creates, what is the most effective way to frame those messages? So we tested, after some qualitative work, 3 different values, 3 different ways of explaining why addressing those inequities is so important. So we used what is in the field kind of the dominant frame, which is the idea of opportunity and equal opportunity. We used another dominant field frame, which is kind of human rights. So housing is, access to affordable, healthy housing is a human right, is something that as people we have the right to access. And then we tried out this other frame which emerged from our work, which is the argument that addressing these inequities in access, inequities in the system is important because as a population we are interdependent, and our success as a society, our success as a group, our ability to move forward is contingent upon having all of us do well. Now, does anyone want to guess where this is going? Okay, I won't leave you on the edge of your seat. So what you're going to see is equal opportunity is going to be this kind of off-green color, housing is going to be this kind of rusty red, and the interdependence is going to be, I should actually pick real colors because I can't describe it. It's like in between blue and purple, okay? And so when you run this, so this is a large experiment. This is about 7,000 Americans, nationally representative along all the categories that you would think of: race and ethnicity, gender, age, political identification, residential location, so whether people are urban, rural, suburban, peri-urban. And when you run this, you get the following. So luckily, you don't see, with one exception, any of those kind of negative drop effects, but you do see the fact that 2 of these values, and it is the values that are kind of most in use by the field, are having no statistical effect, right? So those green bars and those rust-colored bars are statistically indistinguishable from 0. What that means is they make no difference between the group who heard nothing. That is not what you want your communications to do. And instead, you see that this value of interdependence, of social progress, is having these strong, statistically significant increases in the way that people support these issues, the salience that they accord to the issue, their support for kind of zoning regulations, developmental contributions, and a host of policies designed to kind of buttress and increase home ownership. So we'll kind of let that kind of go for a little bit. I have a feeling this is something we're going to want to come back to at the end. But again, I'm using this to make a point that the frames that we choose are not some kind of insignificant frosting that we put on our content, but rather they really matter in terms of what people are going to do with how we are engaging them. So the second reason is, unfortunately, that every single person in this room, me included, has a problem. And it is a problem of communications. So I would say all of those people in the room have probably been in this situation at one time or another, where you think you have the perfect, can't lose, slam dunk way of talking about your work to an external audience. You try it out with 2 of your closest colleagues and it's awesome. Like, what could go wrong when it goes out to normal people? That's a joke there, you hear that? People who don't live and eat and sleep and breathe housing and development all day, every day, 7 days a week for the last 20 years of their lives, as you all do. And you find that when this idea that was so awesome and convincing to your two closest colleagues goes out, one of two things happen. So first of all, it isn't, right? It doesn't land, it doesn't resonate, it doesn't have grip, whatever term you want to use. It kind of goes in one ear and out the other. The second is more unfortunate, but still very frequent, is that argument which sent you and your colleagues just so motivated to go and do this work and support solutions has the opposite effect for people who don't do this work. What in my field is called either a backfire or a boomerang effect. So I'm going to give you one example of what this looks like. Again, I'm going to give you some productive distance in terms of issues, and I'm going to talk about work that we've done on early childhood where this backfire effect is really easy to see. And then I'm going to go back to housing and your work and show you a little bit more about public understanding on that issue. So in the field of early childhood, people want to and do say things like this, that persistent stress can derail development and have all of these negative long-term effects on health and well-being. Now this is an exact quote from a developmental expert. I've made one small change. In the original quote, negative was deleterious. But I have changed that so to be mildly less obnoxious and obvious in the point that I'm about to make. So, but for folks in this field, and there are probably some of you, there's some interesting crossovers between the field of early childhood development and housing that are probably not too subtle for you all who work on these issues, that this is objectively true. Right? There's a lot of research across a long period of time, a lot of disciplines that shows this to be the case. Unfortunately, when messages like this go out to normal people, members of the general public, people who are not developmental scientists or experts, you get things that look and sound like this.
Life's hard. It's supposed to be hard. You know, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. You know, all the bad cliches you can think of. I mean, there's been people that have come from absolutely nothing to make it in whatever society's eyes deems success.
So I don't know if you all could hear that super well. The sound is kind of weird from up here, so I'll make it like crystal clear. That which you heard on the right-hand side of the screen, what does not kill you makes you stronger, is not the intended message that this expert wanted to have when he or she opened his or her mouth to deliver this idea. So something's going on between the intention of the message and its actual effect and reception. So I'm not going to leave you on the edge, very edge of your seats for a second longer, even though you should be able to guess what this is based on how I introduced myself. It is culture. And when I say culture, I don't mean kind of Indiana Jones, external artifact, archaeology kind of culture, which is still what my parents think I do, but rather culture in mind, right? Culture as a set of highly shared but really implicit understandings that we all, even those of us in this room, have in our heads, walk around with us, that become active when we're asked to engage with information that contains particular frames. So in this case, there is a frame. It's the idea of stress, which is activating a cultural model, a way of thinking in this gentleman's head, which then produces the opinion, the attitude, the language that you hear in that interview. So if there's a microphone here, but I want to do this, I just kind of want to pop off really quickly and get some ideas. So maybe we can take like 2 or 3 people, and I have to say the lights are so bright in the back that I can't see much past the first row here, so you got to really wave your hands so that I can see you. But what did you all notice in there? And again, it's probably not stuff that you haven't noticed at... Yep. So, you know, one not so surprising thing about culture is that it comes from somewhere, right? People don't come up with this stuff. They don't like roll out of bed and say, hey, today I'm going to think about housing as a consumer good. They're exposed to a constant diet of frames, of information, of culture that over time kind of come to form the way that they think about issues. So what else did you, so there's 2 people over here. You guys can do rock, paper, scissors to see who gets to go. Okay. Go for, you forgot. And try, if you can, to kind of share your voice a little bit so that I can hear you. Yeah. 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 Yes. So there's a bunch of connected things in here, and you've highlighted one of the things that I think is so interesting. So when you ask people about solutions to housing, you don't get anything about housing. You get things about, help people make more money or make people smarter about how this works. There's nothing about actually addressing housing, which goes back to that very first set of things that you heard, which is people, which I think is the biggest challenge on the issues that you work on, is that housing is understood as a consumer good. You get what you can afford, and that's the way it should be. And if there's a lot of people who can't afford quality sufficient to be healthy, then that's just the way it goes. Work harder or move. Take one more over here. Yep. So this, I will tell you, this is a major focus of the work that we've done with enterprise community partners, obviously because of their work, is to figure out ways of kind of counteracting that assumption. That community development is profit-driven, it's external, it's impositional, and how you create an understanding of community development which more closely approximates the way that I understand the work that you all do. So there's my favorite quote about culture actually doesn't, unfortunately, come from an anthropologist. It comes from JFK, who in 1962 at a commencement speech at Yale University said that the great enemy of the truth is very often not the lie, deliberate, contrived, and dishonest, but the myth, persistent, persuasive, and unrealistic. So to go back to that, the guy with the baseball cap and what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, it's not that he's out to ruin kids' lives. It's not that he went into that interview and say, I hate kids, I want them all to do poorly, but rather that he has a way of understanding, in that case, stress, which complicates, which affects, which puts up a barrier to him understanding the idea that adversity of a chronic and significant nature can have detrimental effects to development. And I would argue that the same thing is true on housing. So the idea here is that, unfortunately, whether you want it to or not, culture complicates your work. And that to be a communications expert, one way of doing that is to become a culture expert, right? So there's a lot of work that's done in communications which is descriptive. We tell people, and normally about the problem, we tell people what the problem is. We tell people what the solutions are, but we don't explain how the problem works, why it is, why the solution is effective. But we'll get to that point on explanation in a second. The third reason is that, and I think all of you can nod your heads knowingly when I say this, is that we know from framing that providing people with more data does not for effective communications make, right? So I'm going to give you an example of this, again, that allows you to have some productive distance, and then I'm going to come back and put it up in your face. So we've done a lot of work on climate change and climate change communication. And there's a group that we work with who came up with the graphic that I'm about to put on the screen as a way of communicating the realities of man-made climate change to a general public audience. And I should say that before I click this clicker here, I should say that they made this graphic before they worked with us. So this is what this group thought would be undeniably effective in communicating the realities of climate change to a public audience, right? So it's ridiculous, right? The really interesting thing is the way in which this graphic was created. So there was a conference call that I was on that there were 6 of these climate scientists on, and the way that this went is they started with, I don't know if you can see my pointer here, they started with the blue line, the purple line, and the orange line. And it took them all of about 2 minutes before someone said, you know what? Without the Northern Hemisphere Greenland curve on here, it's not going to make sense. People won't get it. And then the floodgates were open. 30 seconds later, someone said, you know what we really need to do? You know what would do it? Is if we got the sea level curve on there. Bingo. And then someone said, you know what, we love our one vertical measure, but what if we came up with another one? And it was 3 digits and we put it in red. And then you can see that by the end of this exercise, they're not happy just with a graphic. They've got all of this text that I've actually cut off, and that if I had a bigger screen, would spill all the way down onto the floor. So again, this is a ridiculous example. No one in this room would do anything like this. Right? So these aren't infographics from your field, but they are real infographics. And I would say that there is actually precious little difference between these and what you just saw on the previous screen. So there's a formula that we use, and I've been guilty of this as well as a recovering academic, is that we start with our magic numerical finding. You all have one, right? 1 out of every 10 people can't do this, or 4 out of every 20 people are struggling with that. And that we've picked up, we've learned somewhere along the way that if we can take that and kind of repackage it in charts and graphs and things that have colors and take up half a page, that's awesome. But we're normally not happy with that. We follow that with more evidence, and the assumption is that at some point we reach a layer at which epiphany occurs. People cannot help but to see our issue the way that we do and we want them to. And I am here to tell you that this is simply not an effective way of thinking about communications. But I'm also here to tell you that I am totally opposed to the idea that we live in a post-truth, post-fact world. For one reason, because that assumes that we once did. And we never have. So in the work that we do, a lot of what we try to do is we try to create these narratives, these overarching frames. And we always test those narratives both with and without evidence as part of those stories. And overwhelmingly, we find that a really good narrative with a strategically chosen data point is more effective than that same narrative without. But the takeaway here is that facts are not that story. You don't start with data and end with data, but rather, an effective story has room in it for those facts, for those data points to be used for a particular narrative purpose to a particular end. Okay, the fourth reason why framing matters is because, unfortunately, correcting people's mistakes explicitly, kind of arguing or lawyering your way out of misperceptions, of understandings, is not effective either. And the way that people do this most flagrantly is in the ubiquitous practice of myth-busting. So you can kind of chuckle like, haha, we don't do this. But I've worked on 37 social issues over the last 12 years. I have been able to find a myth fact sheet on each of those issues in under 2 minutes on Google. I have found one on your issue. I'm not going to show you, don't worry. But it's this idea that we tell people how they're wrong, and then we come behind that and we tell them how we're right. And the field that is kind of most flagrantly guilty of this practice is the field of public health. So there may be some public health folks in the room, hopefully no one from the CDC, because I'm going to talk about a CDC example here. So this is kind of a very representative example of what this myth fact kind of practice looks like. So this is something on the flu vaccine from the CDC. And about 15 years ago, a group of social psychologists from the University of Michigan became, let's say, curious as to whether this was actually having the intended effect. So they took this very piece of communication and they exposed a representative sample of Americans to it, and then they asked them a whole bunch of questions to determine kind of what effect was it having. And they found a bunch of interesting things, but for us here today, the following three are most important. First of all, people chronically, persistently, and consistently misremembered the myths as true. That is not good. They also found that effect got worse the further in time people were away from having heard the communication. So when they followed up with people 7, 10, 14 days later, they believed even more strongly in the myth than they did at time one, at time of exposure. And the kicker is that people attribute said false information that they now believe is true to the source of the communication. Again, that is not good news for the CDC. I should say that we're actually working with the CDC right now on recrafting a whole bunch of their myth fact sheets across a number of issues, from public health to tobacco and a bunch of different issues. So they're aware that I use this example. The idea is, however, not that you shouldn't try to correct misperceptions, but that there is a very specific formula and strategy for doing it. And when it comes to this strategy, order is everything. Part of the problem with a myth-fact construction is you start with what people believe. You reinforce that, and then you think that just through the force of sheer logical brilliance, you can correct what you've just concretized. And that is not the case. So to summarize this, and I can make these slides available if people would like. I think this one in particular is really useful because you can do this. That flipping the order is incredibly powerful. Starting with what you want people to believe is the best way to get people to see what you want them to see. Start with where you want to go, set the frame, explain the process, then double back and correct the misperception. So the idea here is that unfortunately cognition is not logical, and if I can get you all to do one and only one thing, leaving this room today, if you are in a position where you have communications cross your desk and you find that a myth fact sheet makes its way onto your plate, don't let it leave, right? Let's stop this practice of myth busting. The fifth reason is that unfortunately, this is another thing that people who work on social issues are wicked good at doing, is that convincing people how dire and on fire your issue is does not make them want to engage and be with you for change. And I said unfortunately because this is stuff that we are so good at. We are awesome at the problem. We are awesome at crisis. We are awesome at urgency. And, there's great housing examples of this where natural disaster metaphors are rampant. My favorite example, I don't know if you can see what this is. So this is the operative metaphor in the aging field. Can everyone see what this is? This is a cresting wave of older adults that's about to crash on the rest of us, on the rest of the population. So this is what in the field is called the silver tsunami, which is and has been their dominant metaphor that they use to try to engage people in their issue. So what do you do if there's a tsunami that's approaching? You run! You don't try to fix it, you run, you get out of the way. Is that there's a lot of people who study this concept of urgency, right? How bad a problem is. But these people, these are social psychologists in particular, are also interested in this incredibly powerful and important other concept which is called efficacy. So efficacy is the degree to which people can see a problem as solvable. The degree to which they can see themselves as being part of a solution, or the social group that they are part of as being kind of able to remediate, to solve a problem. And so they're interested in what happens when you have messages that combine different levels of urgency with different levels of efficacy. And here's what they find. So in this cell in the matrix in the bottom left-hand corner, which is kind of where most social issue communications live. So urgency, 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 teeny little bit of solution at the end. The result of those kind of messages is fatalism. You've convinced me that this is a really bad, horrible problem. I'm going to now go and put it on the pile of other bad, horrible problems that I know about, but that I know nothing can be done about. And the effect is basically, peace, I'm out. You're not going to get my psychological resources expended on this problem about which nothing can be done. Unfortunately, the answer is not just to go kind of all woo-woo, hopey-changey, solutions are everywhere, peace, love, and whatever. Because when you do that, you have another problem, which is snore and bore. Low motivation. You've shown people that solutions are possible, but there's none of that grip, none of that resonance, none of that urgency that you need to create engagement. So I always say that there are no magic words, there are no silver bullets when it comes to communications, and this is the one exception of that rule. Where people have found over and over again that when you are able to marry robust senses of urgency with equally robust senses of efficacy, you create these kind of magically powerful communications that help people engage with your issue and have the ability to kind of change and persuade and get people to see the issue, communicate your perspective as you want. So the idea is to not forget solutions. Like, you all have solutions. And I would encourage you as you go out of this room to go back and look at some of your communications and actually diagnose how much of those communications you're spending on the problem and how much you're spending on the solution. And I've done this before, and I think the number that you tend to get is 90-10. 90% of communications are about the problem, and you're lucky if you get 10%, and it's always at the end, where you talk about solutions. And so the idea here is that we all think in story. Fundamentally, absolutely, this is how we make sense of information. It's how we remember information. It's what's called encoding. It's how we retrieve and pass information. And if you are not telling a story, you are missing out on this most fundamental and powerful feature of the way that people make sense of information. So there's a catch, though, which is that not all stories are created equally. And so we do a lot of work on health equity and have for a long time. And the finding here is really interesting. So most advocates who work on health equity do so through the telling of kind of really narrow, close-up personal stories. It's a story of a person who's struggling with a problem, having difficulties, and normally overcomes said problem through the virtue of their, bootstraps, John Wayne, Jay-Z-ism, able to be, So we tested that kind of story and found that it actually depresses people's support for equity policy. So reinforcing people's sense of individualism actually makes them less supportive of policy solutions to equity issues. But the really interesting thing is if you take that same story and you build context around it, you put that person in a neighborhood, in a context that helps explain that problem and how it works, and shows a solution that's in a community and explains how it affects outcomes, you fundamentally flip the effect. So I will also say, however, that telling those contextual stories is super hard. It is much easier to tell the story about an individual and their trials and tribulations and how they pull themselves up by their bootstraps than it is to tell a story about that individual that makes context a character in the story. But knowing the work that you all do, I believe absolutely, firmly and strongly that you have to have context in the stories that you all tell. I have an example of one of these. I'm going to skip over it because I'm almost out of time. If people are interested, I can refer you to this video. It comes from some work that we do on race and equity and disparity in education. And it's a story about a woman in Chicago, but it is fantastically and beautifully a contextual story. It's not that it doesn't have people in it, but that it has context and systems and structures and resources. So we're going to skip this. Hopefully I can skip it. And I just wanted to present to you, again, there is a formula for doing this. It's a 3-part way of making sure that you create stories by answering narrative questions. So it has the question of why this matters. It has the question of kind of how it works and what's challenging it. That's your spot. And I don't know the woman's name who made this point at the beginning, but that's your spot for explanation. That's your spot to make people smarter about your issue, and I don't mean that in a patronizing way, but we can make people smarter about the issues that we work on and the work that we do. And finally, kind of this part of the story that a lot of social issue communicators forget to do, which is the so what? What's the resolution? What do we need to do? And what would change if we did it? So in summary, we've talked about how the frames you choose, the choices you make as communicators matter greatly. We've talked about, unfortunately, the way that culture complicates all of our jobs as communicators. We've talked about the way in which facts are not the frame, but can and should be part of every and all effective story. We've talked about how we all need to stop, if we are able, to not let things leave our desk, to stop this practice of myth-busting. We've talked about the importance of not forgetting solutions in our communications and striving for balance between urgency and efficacy. We've talked about how stories are so powerful and sticky as ways of communicating information. I hope you have also, throughout this process, come to see that framing itself is awesome, right? Unbelievably awesome. And I would like to just leave you with one of my favorite quotes of the day, which comes from a philosopher named Richard Rorty, who says that a talent for speaking differently rather than arguing well is the chief instrument of cultural change. And with that, I will say thank you. I will encourage you all to leave this room and frame on. Thank you. I think we have about 5 minutes, 6 minutes, 5 minutes and 47 seconds for Q&A. If anybody has questions that they'd like to ask, you can either do so from your seat, or there is a microphone, standing microphone here in the front. Thank you very much. I realize it's a long walk. You're at the opposite end of the room. Thank you very much.
So just want to throw this out there. Is it possible to speak to your base, or are you always speaking to everybody?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It's a really hard question. And that brings us to the end of the audience participation component of the day. No. That's a really interesting question because it's a tension in the field in which we work. So there are a lot of people who do communications that kind of adhere to the split and pull model of communications, which is invigorate your base, alienate the other side, and pull a couple percent over to your side. That's kind of a type of communication that is founded on electoral issues and kind of legislative work. That is not the kind of work that we do. We are interested in putting out messages and frames that over time, to the broad public, move people's cultural understanding in a particular direction, changing the context in which all policy decisions are made. I'm not saying that the split and pull one is not valid. It is and has been a really powerful way to do electoral legislative work, but it is not the kind of work that we do. So I would answer your question by saying the goal is to come up with messages that all people can hear and that over time begin to change what they think is possible and how they think issues work. Please.
So my question is in relative to the stickiness of the reframing. Like, have you done studies on when you do some kind of work on reframing, how likely it is? You had the real quick change in those on the street videos. So what's the kind of, how do you make this stickiness, I guess, stick?
Yep. So there's two concepts, one of which I've called stickiness. I don't think that's actually what it's called. It's called transmittability. So the ability of a frame once heard to be kind of remembered and passed. So that's what I call stickiness. We have a method that we use to test that. It's a fancy, very expensive game of telephone in which we pass a frame to two people who then have to talk about an issue, and we see whether they talk about that issue using the frame. And that continues. They pass it to two more people, they pass it to two more people, they pass it to two more people, they pass it to two more people. And so that is a method that's designed specifically to see whether a particular frame is sticky, whether it transmits across generations. There's another part of what you talked about, which is a concept which is called durability. So if I hear a frame once, how durable is that effect over time? So in the Australian example, if I hear about child development once and I become wildly more supportive of policies and I indicate my intention to behave in a different way, how residual is that effect? And the results on that are decidedly more depressing, is that hearing a frame once does not fundamentally change the way that people understand social issues. But I will say that that's not the model, right? The idea here is that fields take up frames and this is going to sound a little bit bad, but they kind of get it in the water. They dose people with it over time such that every time you hear about community development or housing, you're likely to hear this frame. And so it's this drip, drip, this residual effect that over time starts to move and change the way that people think. It's never kind of like a single dose of a framing intervention is going to lead people to see the world in wildly and completely different ways forever. Right. right? So you want it to, I mean, I like the in the water thing, I realize is an unfortunate metaphor, but you kind of want to get it in the air, right? You want to have it be something that people breathe every time they take a breath of your issue. I think we are one more, and then I'll let y'all go.
Well, to that point, I'm wondering if you can speak to the way in which it seems there has been rapid movement in our culture in changing the way marriage equality is viewed. And it seems to me that I was pleased and delighted, but that we seem to move fairly quickly to that point. Now, there's a regression that's taking place, but can you speak to that issue in terms of the changing cultural frame?
Yeah. So that is, it's kind of everyone's favorite example for a number of reasons, but there is a misperception of that example, which is fairly rampant and rife, which is that it happened like that. Didn't happen like that, right? It happened, so there's part of what you're saying is true, but also have to realize that as a field, those folks and the foundations that supported them were making investments for 20 to 30 years in kind of changing and tilling the soil. Now, they did find, through research, that there was this frame shift that happened. They went from talking about marriage as a right to talking about kind of love and kind of allowing people to feel what this feels like. And that, as a frame change, did kind of land and precipitate what looks like fairly rapid change. But you have to understand that that kind of seed of a frame wasn't planted in concrete, right? It was planted in this kind of long-term change work that the field had been doing for a long time. So it looks like this was the answer, boop, but it was actually this plus this, which was the answer, if any of those hand gestures made sense. Yeah. So thank you all very much. It was great to talk with you. I appreciate your questions.